They say grief fades with time, but what if time only teaches it how to hide? Tonight, I'm about to open the book that buried every lie I ever believed about love. A book written by my husband, after his death. And once I read what's inside, nothing in this house, not even the silence, will ever be the same again. This is where truth stops whispering and starts haunting. And believe me, this is only... My name is Margaret Hale, and what you're about to hear are the echoes of a life divided between love, loss, and truth. If my story touched you, stay close. Subscribe and walk with me through every chapter. It was past midnight when I heard the sound that changed everything, a porcelain cup shattering against the kitchen floor. The noise was small, almost delicate, yet it carried the weight of a confession. I stood there, frozen between the table and the open window, as the night breathed its cold air against my face. Clara bent down to gather the pieces before I could move, her hands trembling more than the porcelain itself. "I'll clean it," she whispered, but her voice broke in the middle, as if the words themselves had been sliced open by the silence. The cup had been Robert's favorite. Cream-colored, chipped on one side, a flaw he used to trace with his thumb every morning while reading the paper. Seeing it in fragments felt like watching another part of him die, long after the funeral had ended. I knelt beside Clara, our reflections bending together on the floor like two ghosts sharing the same wound. "It's just a cup," she murmured again, though her eyes betrayed something else, not grief, but guilt. Behind her, on the wooden table, lay the condolence book. Its leather cover caught the dim kitchen light like a pulse, steady and silent. Every page was filled with words meant to heal. "He was a good man. You were blessed. Time will make it easier." I had read them all so many times the ink felt memorized by my heart. Yet that night, the book looked different, heavier, almost alive. Clara noticed me looking at it. Her hand paused mid-air, still holding a piece of porcelain. "Maybe you should put that away," she said quietly. "You've read it enough." Her tone was strange, careful, almost rehearsed. And then I saw it. The faint tremor in her fingers as they brushed against the book's edge, the way her eyes refused to meet mine. "Why are you shaking?" I asked. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "It's cold," she said. But the heater was on. The night outside pressed against the windows, thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 1. The house, my house, felt like a museum of gestures. 2 cups on the counter, 1 broken, a table that remembered conversations now forbidden, a chair that no one dared to sit on since Robert's absence had become louder than his presence ever was. I poured what was left of the tea into the sink, watching the liquid swirl and disappear. "He used to say tea tasted like time," I whispered. It wasn't meant for Clara, but she answered anyway. "He did," she said softly. "He told me that once." The words landed between us like another crack on the floor. "He told me that once." The phrase was harmless, almost tender. Unless you knew Robert. Unless you knew how carefully he chose what to share and with whom. I didn't ask how she knew. Not yet. But my silence was its own kind of question. Earlier that evening, I had found her sitting by the window of the study, reading through the condolence book. She said it comforted her, that reading the words others wrote about Robert helped her feel closer to me. It was strange, hearing that from someone who had held my hand through every prayer and sleepless night, someone who had been my anchor when everything else dissolved. Clara had been more than a friend after Robert's death. She was the keeper of my strength. She organized the meals, answered the calls, stayed through every storm of tears. People called her an angel, and for a while I agreed. But angels don't tremble when they touch a memory. Now, as we swept the broken cup into a dustpan, her eyes drifted again toward the table, toward that book. "Do you ever wish you could forget?" she asked suddenly. I wish I could remember differently, I said. She looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw fear in her face, not of being judged, but of being known. After she left that night, I couldn't sleep. I made my way back to the kitchen, drawn to the silence she'd left behind. The air still smelled faintly of chamomile and the lavender lotion she used on her hands. The broken cup sat inside the bin, wrapped in paper towels like a body prepared for burial. And there, on the table, was the condolence book, open to a page I didn't remember leaving open. My name was written in small, uneven letters on the top corner, Margaret, followed by a single line I had never seen before. Forgive me for what kindness could not fix. The handwriting was Robert's. I knew it instantly. The slightly tilted R, the loop in the G that always dipped below the line. But the date written beside it was wrong. It was 2 weeks before he died. My fingers went cold. I turned the page. Beneath a cluster of sympathy notes was something pressed between the sheets. A small dried flower, pale blue, brittle. I lifted it carefully, and the faintest scent of perfume filled the air. Clara's perfume. I sat there for a long time, staring at that fragile thing, trying to believe in coincidence. But even grief has its patterns, and mine had just shifted. The clock struck 2. I reached for the book again, flipping through pages that once felt sacred. Messages of comfort blurred into a fog of ink and pity. And then I saw it. A signature that looked almost like Clara's, but written with deliberate restraint, as if someone had tried to disguise it. I remembered the funeral day. The way she stood slightly apart from everyone else, her hands clasped around that same book, offering it to each guest with a softness that now felt rehearsed. She had written in it that day, I was sure. But why would she sign again, on another page, weeks earlier, unless she had been part of something before the mourning began? I ran my fingers along the edges of the book. Between 2 pages, there was a faint tear, the outline of a sheet that had been removed. The spine had loosened, like a wound that refused to close. That was when the door creaked. Clara's voice came from the hallway. "You're still awake?" I didn't answer right away. I closed the book gently, as though it might shatter too. I was just remembering. She stepped closer, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. Her eyes went to the book, then to my hands. "Maybe I should take it," she said softly. "Keep it safe for a while. You don't need to reopen that pain." The sentence was meant to sound caring, but something about it tightened around me like a rope. "Why would you want to keep it?" I asked. Her lips parted. No words came, only a tremor. "Margaret," she whispered finally, "some memories aren't ready to be read." For a moment, I thought I heard Robert's voice, not as sound, but as memory. Truth doesn't arrive with comfort. It arrives with clarity. It was something the Reverend had once told him, and he had repeated to me when our marriage was going through one of those quiet storms that never quite made it into arguments. Clara's eyes filled with something unspoken. "I'll bring it back in a few days," she said. I didn't stop her when she took the book. My hands felt heavy, my breath caught between disbelief and surrender. She left through the back door, the same one Robert used to slip through for his morning walks. When it closed, the silence was absolute, a silence that didn't feel like peace, but like absence rearranged into something sharper. I stood there until the first light began to rise behind the curtains, casting a pale reflection across the shards still trapped in the dustpan. I thought of how Robert used to hold that cup, of how he'd trace the chip with his thumb, like a familiar flaw he'd grown to love. Maybe we all do that, hold on to what's broken, until it cuts us deep enough to feel alive again. I didn't know yet what I would find in those pages when they came back to me. But I knew this. Clara's hands had trembled not from cold, but from something that feared the light. And for the first time since Robert's death, I realized that grief wasn't my only visitor in this house. Clara returned the condolence book 3 days later, wrapped in brown paper as if it were something fragile or forbidden. She placed it gently on the kitchen table, the same spot where the cup had fallen. I noticed the small crease in the wrapping, as if she'd hesitated before letting it go. "I thought you might want it back," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm people wear when they've rehearsed remorse. I thanked her without looking up. I didn't want her to see my hands shaking as I untied the string. The paper gave way with a soft sigh, and there it was again. The leather cover, warm from her touch, faintly smelling of her perfume and dust. The book that had held my comfort now looked like a confession sealed in ink. She stood near the doorway, holding her coat. "Margaret, maybe it's time to let the past rest." I turned a page without answering. Her words felt heavy, like advice soaked in guilt. "Some pasts," I said quietly, "don't rest until they're read." Her eyes flickered, fear, perhaps, or recognition. And then she left. The sound of the door closing was the same as that night, final, deliberate, echoing longer than it should have. That afternoon, rain finally came. It fell against the kitchen window in long, tired strokes, as if the sky were remembering something too. I sat by the table with a blanket draped over my shoulders, the book before me like a sleeping animal. Every time I touched it, I felt a pulse beneath my fingertips, a rhythm that wasn't mine. The first pages were the same, notes of comfort, signatures, small hearts drawn beside names. I recognized the handwriting of neighbors, parish friends, even the reverend. But somewhere around the middle the tone shifted. The ink grew darker, the sentences shorter, almost coded. "Some kindnesses are too deep for the world to see," one line read. Another, "Love is not always loyal to its place." They were unsigned, written in the margins like whispers, too ashamed to stand in the light. I leaned closer, tracing one with my finger. The pen had pressed hard enough to mark the next page. Whoever wrote them wanted permanence. As I turned the paper, something fluttered loose, a thin strip, torn clean along the binding. My heart stuttered. The missing page from that night was still gone, but this fragment had been hiding beneath it, like a secret that refused to disappear. On it was half a sentence in Robert's hand. "If she ever finds this, tell her—" The rest was gone. I pressed the torn edge against my palm and felt the tremor crawl up my arm. The rain outside grew louder, and in its rhythm I heard his voice again. Not in words, but in the quiet tone he used when truth approached, slow and painful. By evening, the light had dimmed into gold. The smell of rain had turned to earth. I took the book to the study, the room Robert used to call his sanctuary. Dust had settled thick over his desk, but his chair still faced the window, as if waiting for a man who might walk back in. I sat. The pages fluttered under my thumb until I reached the section written near the date of his death. There, between notes of comfort, someone had written something faint in pencil. I kept my promise. She doesn't know. It wasn't Robert's handwriting. It wasn't mine. And though I wanted to deny it, the loops of the letters, the way the K curved downward, the way the S leaned left, were all too familiar. Clara's. I closed the book, pressing it to my chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Later that night, I found myself staring at the mirror above the fireplace. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Grief had carved new geography across my face. Behind me, the book lay open, its pages reflecting the flicker of the fire. I remembered how Clara had been at the hospital, how she held my coat while the nurse told me Robert was gone. I remembered the way she wept, louder than I did, as though the loss had been hers, and perhaps, in some cruel way, it had been. I sat again and opened to the first page where her handwriting appeared. "He said you were his light." The ink had faded, but the meaning burned clear. It was written beneath another person's note, almost hidden, as if she wanted to speak, but not be heard. The room swayed around me. I reached for my diary, the one Reverend Whitmore had given me after the funeral. "Write," he'd said, "it's how the soul exhales." So I wrote. Clara's grief resembles mine too closely. Her tears fall in the right places, but I can't tell if they belong to her heart or mine. Tonight, I saw a tremor in her kindness, a secret crouching behind her tenderness. I want to believe in her still, but faith feels heavier when truth begins to breathe. I closed the diary, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. The world was quiet again, but inside me, something had begun to speak. The next morning, I carried the condolence book to the garden. The sky was pale, and the scent of wet soil rose like memory. I sat by Robert's favorite bench, the one beneath the elm where he used to read, and opened the book again. A pressed flower slipped free, blue, fragrant, the same one I had found before. I held it close to my face and realized the scent wasn't faint anymore. It was recent, fresh perfume clinging to an old petal. Someone had touched it, recently. That realization broke something gentle inside me, because I remembered that scent. I had smelled it just yesterday, when Clara hugged me before leaving. The flower fell from my fingers and landed in the dirt. It looked small, defeated, but strangely beautiful, like grief itself, delicate, persistent, and never where you left it. As days passed, I began rereading every entry. The book became a map of voices, each sentence a small island. But the more I read, the more I noticed certain words repeating: quiet courage, kindness, grace under burden. They were the phrases Robert had often used to describe Clara. The overlap was too neat to be chance. I found myself whispering aloud, "What were you trying to tell me, Robert?" But the pages remained silent. By the third night, I couldn't bear it anymore. I took the book to bed, as if sleeping beside it would make the truth gentler. I left the lamp on and began again, from the first line to the last. Around halfway through, a faint smudge caught my eye, ink blurred by moisture. I lifted the page closer and saw the stain wasn't random. It was shaped like a tear that had dried mid-fall. For a moment, I imagined Clara crying while writing something she shouldn't. The thought made my stomach turn. That's when I noticed another mark, faint but deliberate, at the bottom of the same page, a small cross drawn in pencil. It wasn't a symbol of faith, but of location, like a sign saying, "Look here." I turned the page. Behind it, embedded within the binding, was a corner of another paper, folded small, as if someone had tried to hide it. My hands shook as I eased it free. It was a note, old, creased, written in Robert's hand. "Clara, thank you for keeping her steady. Don't let her fall." The words were tender, but tenderness can wound too. I stared at the ink until the lines blurred. My husband's gratitude to another woman, hidden in a book, meant for my comfort. My name wasn't there, but my absence was written all over it. I felt something inside me split, quietly, like a thread snapping. At dawn, I went to the chapel. Reverend Whitmore's voice echoed faintly from a service in the next room. I didn't enter. I just stood in the hallway, holding the book to my chest. The smell of candles, wood, and dust mixed with something like forgiveness. Distant, unreachable. When he saw me, he smiled gently. "Still writing?" he asked. "Reading," I said. He nodded, as if that were the same thing. "Then you're still healing." I wanted to tell him that reading can wound too, that sometimes words reopen what time had tried to stitch. But I just smiled and said, "Perhaps." Before leaving, he touched my shoulder lightly. "Truth isn't cruel, Margaret. It's precise. It cuts where healing must begin." Those words stayed with me the whole way home. That evening, as I sat by the window, I realized I was no longer crying for Robert. I was crying for the woman I'd been, the one who believed grief had only one face. But now I understood. Love, when hidden, becomes deceit, and deceit always leaves fingerprints. The condolence book lay open on my lap. The margins, once filled with comforting words, now felt like confession walls. Every scribble, every tremor of ink, told a story of divided hearts and borrowed tenderness. And as the last light faded from the garden, I noticed something I hadn't before. The first page, the one with the funeral date, had a faint indentation, as if someone had written a message there and then torn it out. Under the right light, I could still make out the trace of a word pressed into the page: forgive. But the rest of the sentence was gone. I closed the book slowly. The air felt heavy with things unsaid. Somewhere beyond the walls, thunder rolled again. And in that sound, I heard what I already knew. The truth wasn't coming for me. It had always been here, waiting, quietly, between the margins. It was a Thursday afternoon when Clara returned. The rain had washed the streets clean, and the scent of damp earth followed her through the doorway. She stood there, framed by the soft gray light, holding a basket of lemons from her garden, as if citrus could sweeten what she had soured. "I thought you might need these," she said. Her smile trembled just enough to betray its weight. I thanked her, though I didn't remember asking for anything. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock Robert had loved. Time had grown different since his death, elastic, unpredictable. Some hours lingered like ghosts, others slipped by unnoticed. Clara filled the silence easily, talking about weather, the church, small things that didn't matter, but filled the air like fog. I let her speak because silence between us had begun to sound dangerous. After tea, she moved toward the table. The condolence book was still there, half open, as though it refused to close before the truth was finished. I saw her glance at it the way a thief might glance at the scene of her own crime. She hesitated. Then, softly, "Margaret, do you ever feel haunted by kindness?" I looked at her. The question was strange, almost poetic, but her voice carried something raw. "What do you mean?" She traced the rim of her cup with a finger. "Sometimes the good we do," she paused, "hurts someone else without meaning to. Have you ever felt that?" I thought of Robert's letter, the one thanking her for keeping me steady. The words still burned in my chest. "I suppose all kindness costs something," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the book. "Then maybe it's best when it isn't remembered." There it was, the shift in the air, that quiet plea disguised as wisdom. "You want to forget?" I said. She swallowed hard. "I think some things aren't meant to be held forever. They begin to rot if we keep them too long." I stared at her hands, the same hands that had once made soup for me every day after the funeral, the same hands that folded the condolence pages back into their cover with reverence. I had trusted those hands. I had let them hold what I couldn't. Now I wondered what else they had held in secret. The light dimmed through the curtains, and shadows stretched long across the floor. She stood, smoothing her skirt, her composure unraveling one breath at a time. "I can take the book for a while," she said suddenly. "Keep it safe for you, until you're ready to look at it again." The words were gentle, almost maternal, but beneath them was panic, the quiet desperation of someone trying to contain a fire before it spread. "Safe from what?" I asked. She froze. From yourself, perhaps. You've been reliving too much, Margaret. It isn't healthy." Healthy. The word tasted clinical, sterile, out of place in this house, where every corner carried a memory still warm. "Is that what you think this is?" I said. "Illness?" Her eyes darted to mine. "I just want to help." The same phrase she had used at the funeral, the same tone. I almost smiled at the symmetry of it, how grief repeats itself in circles, how comfort can turn to suffocation if held too long. "Then answer me something," I said quietly. "When you look at that book, what do you see?" She hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only silence, a silence that trembled. I stood and crossed to the shelf where the afternoon light was faintly touching Robert's photograph. In it, he was smiling the small, tired smile he reserved for home. I remembered the warmth of that smile, the way it once made me feel safe. And then I remembered the note. "Clara, thank you for keeping her steady." My safety had been someone else's burden. I turned back to her. "If the book frightens you, you can say it," I said. She shook her head quickly. "It doesn't frighten me." But her fingers were twisting her ring, once, twice, over and over, as though it might erase guilt through motion. "Then why do you want to take it?" Her eyes glistened. "Because I can't stand the way you look at it, like it's him, like he's still speaking through it." The truth in that line startled me. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Perhaps she thought taking the book would silence him, that erasing his words might erase her sin. But silence never erases, it only hides. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Please, let me keep it for a few days. You shouldn't have to carry this alone." Her plea was earnest, trembling. It was the same voice she used when praying. "Clara," I said softly, "if you take that book, I'll only wonder what you're trying to protect me from, or who." Her face paled. "You think I think you're afraid," I interrupted, "and I want to know why." The room thickened with unsaid things. The clock ticked louder, as though marking the distance between us. She sat down again, her eyes glassy. "Margaret, I loved you both," she whispered. There, the words she hadn't meant to let escape. My breath caught. The air seemed to fold in on itself. "Both?" I repeated. Her hands flew to her face. "Not like that. Not at first. He was lonely, and I was—" She stopped herself, as if naming it would make it real. "It wasn't what you think." But it was exactly what I thought. And yet, even then, my anger didn't roar. It came like a tide at dusk, slow, heavy, deliberate. She kept speaking, her voice shaking through confessions half-born. "He was sick, Margaret. You were exhausted. He didn't want to burden you with how afraid he was. I just listened. That's all it was at first." "At first," I repeated. Her silence was confirmation enough. I looked at her. This woman who had held my hand at the graveside, who had wiped my tears with the same fingers that had once traced the outline of my husband's fear. "He asked me not to tell you," she said. "He thought it would spare you." A laugh escaped me. Quiet, bitter, hollow. "Spare me from what? The truth?" She shook her head, crying now. "From the confusion. From wondering if love changes shape when death comes near." Her words sounded like something Robert would have said, thoughtful, tragic, evasive. I pressed my hands together to stop their trembling. "You think this was love?" Her eyes rose to mine, red and sincere. "I think it was mercy." That word cut deeper than any betrayal could. Mercy. As if infidelity could be holy when cloaked in pity. I stood, turning toward the window. The rain had started again, tracing the glass in slow, sorrowful patterns. I could see our reflections, two women framed by loss, both dressed in mourning, though for different reasons. "You should go," I said quietly. She didn't move. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "If I could take it back—" "You already tried," I said, glancing at the book. "You tried to take it back and keep it." Her tears fell freely now. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You already did." The words were calm, but they landed like stones. She nodded, unable to argue. And then she reached for her coat, her movements trembling. At the door, she turned. "Will you ever forgive me?" I looked at the book, then at her. "Forgiveness isn't a door, Clara. It's a boundary. I'll build it when I find the truth." She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Then she left, closing the door behind her with the same soft finality she had used when Robert died. The house was silent again. I walked back to the table, the book still lying open, its pages curling from humidity. I ran my hand over it, not as a mourner now, but as someone reading a crime scene left in plain sight. The note, the missing page, the flower, the confession, each piece forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. I thought of the Reverend's words, "Truth cuts where healing must begin." The truth had cut. Now, healing would have to bleed. That night, I dreamed of the funeral, Robert's coffin draped in white lilies, the condolence book resting beside it, Clara standing behind me, her hand steady on my shoulder. In the dream, I turned to her, but her face was blurred, replaced by mine. When I woke, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, as though a window had been opened in a sealed room. I sat up and realized what I had to do. I would read every page again, not as widow or friend, but as witness. The truth would not be handed to me. I would extract it, line by line, until it confessed itself. The dawn light broke pale across the kitchen. I opened the book to where her confession began, and I read until my eyes burned. Words blurred into revelation, and when I closed it, I felt something shift inside me, not closure, not peace, but certainty. I would confront her again, but next time, not as the woman she comforted, as the woman she deceived. And in that certainty, a quiet resolve took root. Because forgiveness, I was beginning to understand, isn't the end of pain. It's the moment you choose to walk through it, alone, unflinching. By the next morning, the book no longer frightened me. It dared me. The rain had passed, leaving the world polished and raw. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, touching the leather cover like a reluctant blessing. I brewed tea out of habit, though I never drank it. The steam rose in spirals, the kind Robert used to follow with his eyes, as if tracking something divine. The cup remained empty beside me, the book open. Every word now looked different, as though the light itself had turned interrogator. I began to trace the signatures one by one, whispering the names aloud: neighbors, parish friends, distant cousins. Each signature was a piece of history, a witness to my grief. But then, halfway down one page, a name snagged my breath: C. Jennings. It shouldn't have meant anything, but the way the ink looped around the J, too elegant, too deliberate, pulled me back to that first night, to Clara's trembling hands reaching for this same book. I leaned closer, running my fingers across the letters. The ink had bled slightly, as though it had been written over once more, reinforced, not erased. Why rewrite a signature unless you meant to hide what it really said? I turned the page, and there it was again, not C. Jennings this time, but a small initial near the bottom corner of another condolence note. It looked like an afterthought, a whisper left behind. C. The handwriting was identical. It appeared again on the next page, and the next, sometimes near the date, sometimes hidden beneath another person's message. It was as if she had been writing herself into my grief in fragments, scattered like crumbs for the truth to follow. I carried the book into the study, where Robert's scent still lingered faintly, a mix of ink, cedar, and something human I couldn't name. The afternoon light fell across the desk, illuminating the uneven texture of the pages. I took a pencil and began to circle every place her hand appeared. By the time I reached the final page, the book looked diseased, a body marked by infection. There were 9 signatures, 3 initials, 2 full names, and one message written in a tone only lovers use when they believe the world isn't watching. You are never alone, even when she sleeps beside you. The air left my lungs like a confession. It was dated 3 months before Robert died. I sat there, staring at that sentence, until I couldn't tell if I was reading words or wounds. For weeks after the funeral, I had believed the house was haunted by Robert's absence. But now I understood it had been haunted by the living all along. Still, grief is a strange teacher. It doesn't shout its lessons, It whispers them through pain until you can no longer ignore their logic. Clara's love, if that was what it had been, wasn't a storm. It was erosion, quiet, steady, disguised as help. I thought of all the nights she had sat in this room, sorting through condolence letters, assuring me that rest was a kind of faith. She had read the words meant for me before I ever did. She had folded my pain into hers, and I had thanked her for it. How easy it is, I thought, to mistake deceit for devotion when grief blinds you to the difference. I stood, pacing slowly, the book pressed against my chest. On the wall hung Robert's photograph, not the formal one from his office, but the candid I had taken on our 30th anniversary. He was laughing, eyes closed, head tilted back. I remembered that day clearly. The wind lifting his hair, Clara standing just outside the frame, handing me the camera. She had always known how to make people look better in light. And perhaps that was her sin. She believed she could edit truth with tenderness. The knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. But when I opened it, it was Reverend Whitmore. His presence carried the quiet gravity of an old hymn. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "You weren't at service yesterday, and I thought I'd stop by." He looked at me, then at the book in my hands. "You've been reading again." "Yes," I said, "but I'm not sure it's reading anymore. It feels more like excavating." He smiled softly, the kind of smile meant to steady shaking faith. "Sometimes truth sleeps under comfort. You have to disturb the peace to find it." I invited him in. He sat across from me, hands folded, patient. I showed him the pages, not the confessions, not the signatures, just the patterns. He examined them quietly. Then, in that voice that always felt half earth, half eternity, he said, "Grief has a way of attracting mirrors. Sometimes they reflect us, sometimes they distort. Do you know which one she was?" I shook my head. "I thought she was my reflection. Now I think she was the shadow behind it." He nodded slowly. "Then you already know what must come next." I did. I had known since she left. That night, I sat by candlelight and began writing down every discovery in my diary, each signature, each date, each line that didn't belong. It felt methodical, almost forensic, yet there was nothing detached about it. Every entry was another incision. When I reached the 9th signature, I stopped. My eyes burned, and I pressed the pencil against the page until the tip broke. The sound startled me, echoing through the room like the cup that had shattered days ago. It occurred to me then that grief always circles back to the sound of breaking. Whether porcelain, vows, or trust, it's the same language. I closed the diary, breathing in the faint scent of candle wax and dust. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, distant, restless. I envied its simplicity, how it could just cry out at the unknown. I meanwhile had to sit quietly and name every ghost before I could let them leave. In the morning, I returned to the kitchen. The tea was cold from the night before, the cup untouched. I opened the book once more, my fingers steady now. I began reading the condolences not as words of comfort, but as evidence, each line a clue, each page a testimony. Then I saw it, beneath one of the earliest entries, almost invisible beneath the faded ink, a faint indentation, not written in pen, but pressed into the paper as if by a trembling hand. I tilted it toward the light. The message appeared like breath on glass. "Tell her gently." The letters were Robert's. My throat tightened. Tell her what and why gently? It was dated 1 week before his death. The book slipped from my hands, landing open on the floor. The candlelight from the night before had melted into daylight now, and for a second, the words shimmered like they were alive. Gently. I remembered Clara's trembling voice the night she asked to take the book. I remembered her saying some memories aren't ready to be read. Now I understood. She had been following his instructions. She had tried to protect me, but in the process, she had rewritten him. I picked up the book, dusting the cover, holding it against my chest. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way anger usually lives. What I felt was closer to mourning, not for Robert, not even for Clara, but for the version of myself who had believed that love was pure if it spoke softly. I had mistaken volume for virtue, silence for peace. But the truth is quiet too. It just doesn't ask permission to speak. That evening, I placed the book on the mantel beside Robert's photograph. The candle beside it flickered weakly, as though struggling to keep pace with my thoughts. For the first time in weeks, I prayed aloud, not for vengeance, not even for clarity, just for the courage to face the next conversation without bitterness, because it was coming. I could feel it, like thunder gathering behind calm skies. Clara would return, and when she did, the truth would no longer hide in ink or margins. It would speak in our voices, our silences, and whatever mercy remained between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I dreamt of signatures floating in water, their ink dissolving into blue clouds. One name rose above all others, Clara. When I reached for it, it broke apart, the letters scattering into smaller ones that formed a single word: forgive. I woke before dawn, whispering that word to the empty room, not as surrender, but as promise. Forgiveness would come, but not as comfort. It would come as truth finally finding air. I hadn't planned to see him that morning, but some visits are chosen by silence long before we decide to make them. The sky was heavy with fog when I left the house. The garden smelled of wet leaves, the kind Robert used to collect for pressing between the pages of his books. I wrapped my scarf tightly and walked down the lane to the chapel, the one with the crooked bell tower that never seemed to ring at the right time. Inside, the air was still and familiar. Beeswax, old wood, a faint echo of hymns from yesterday's service. The pews were empty except for one man seated near the front. Reverend Whitmore, with his head bowed and his hands folded over his Bible, as if the words inside it had to be held still or they might escape. He looked up when he heard me. "Margaret," he said, his smile soft but lined with knowing, "you look as though you've been walking through ghosts." "I suppose I have," I answered. He gestured for me to sit beside him. I did. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting us in soft fragments of color, blues and golds that trembled over the floor like spilled mercy. I held the condolence book in my lap, its weight more honest than my own heart. "I've been reading again," I said. He nodded. "And what have you found this time?" "The truth, or something pretending to be it." He leaned slightly, his eyes searching mine. "You've always had a talent for precision, Margaret. Tell me what shape it takes now." I opened the book to the page where Robert's hidden message lay pressed into the paper. "Tell her gently." I ran my fingers across the indentation, careful, reverent. "He wanted her to tell me," I said, "about them." The Reverend's eyes didn't widen, didn't flinch. He had long practiced the art of receiving pain as if it were prayer. "I see," he murmured. "She thought she was sparing me. But it was never mercy. It was control. She edited my grief as if it were hers to rewrite." I looked down at my hands, still steady, though my voice wasn't. I thought I was healing. I was just being kept blind. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Sometimes the kindest people commit the cruelest silences." The sentence hung between us like the echo of a bell. I closed the book. I don't know what to do with it now, with her, with him, with the part of me that still wants to forgive, even when forgiveness feels like surrender. He folded his hands, thoughtful. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's release. But release must have a gate, or everything escapes, even your dignity. I turned his words over in my mind, tracing them the way I had traced Robert's handwriting. "A gate," I repeated. He nodded. "Yes, people confuse forgiveness with permission, but forgiveness is a border. It defines where your peace begins and where their chaos ends. I let the words settle. They felt both ancient and newly carved, as if they'd waited years for my ears. He stood then, walking toward the altar. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his steps. "Do you remember the day of Robert's service?" he asked. "Every second of it." "I remember too. You stood by the window afterward, watching the rain, and you said, 'The hardest part of love is learning how to bury it without losing its shape.'" I smiled faintly. "Did I really say that?" He chuckled. "You did, and you were right. Love doesn't die when a body does. It simply changes rooms." He turned to face me again. "The question is, which room will you let it live in now? The room of deceit or the room of truth?" I looked at the book, then at him. "The truth hurts." "So does infection," he said. "That's why we clean wounds even when it stings." He sat beside me again. "Tell me what you intend to do." "I want to confront her," I said. "Not to shame her, but to return what she gave me, the truth in full." He nodded. "And after?" "I don't know. Maybe I'll forgive her. Maybe I won't. I just know I can't carry her secret any longer. It belongs to the light now." He smiled, a sad smile full of faith. "Then let the light do its work. It never rushes, but it never fails." For a while, neither of us spoke. The quiet was not empty. It was alive, like the pause between inhale and exhale when you realize breathing itself is a kind of prayer. Finally, he said, "Do you believe Robert loved you?" The question pierced through everything else. "Yes," I said immediately, then softer, "but not always rightly." The Reverend's eyes softened. "Few do. Love, like faith, is often sincere but misdirected. What matters now is not his flaw, but your integrity, what you choose to build from it." I nodded, tears finally rising, not the kind that burn, but the kind that cleanse. "I keep asking God why I didn't see it," I said. "Was I blind, or did I simply choose the softer lie?" "Perhaps both," he said. "But now you've chosen truth. That's what makes this moment holy." He rose to light a candle. "Would you like to pray?" he asked. I hesitated. "I don't know what to ask for anymore." "Then don't ask," he said gently. "Just listen." So I did. The silence filled the chapel, thick, sacred. In that silence, I felt something loosen in my chest, as though the weight of pretending was finally sliding off my ribs. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even grieving. I was simply aware of breath, of truth, of life continuing. When the prayer ended, he turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "Margaret, forgiveness doesn't erase the wound. It closes it so you stop bleeding into other people's lives." I nodded slowly. "Then I suppose it's time I stop bleeding." He smiled. "Then start by giving back what isn't yours to hold. Pain, secrets, even their redemption, those belong to God." His hand rested on mine for a moment, steady and warm. "When you go to her, go as yourself, not as the widow she betrayed. Go as the woman she underestimated." The fog had lifted when I left the chapel. The world looked rinsed clean. The air smelled of pine and wet stone. I walked home slowly, the condolence book tucked under my arm. The Reverend's words echoed with every step. A gate, not a door. By the time I reached my house, the sunlight had broken through the clouds, scattering across the floorboards. For a brief moment, the book's shadow fell perfectly over Robert's photograph, his smile half in light, half in shade. I whispered to it, "You loved us both, but you broke us unevenly." Then I set the book down on the table. That evening, I wrote in my diary, "I've learned that forgiveness isn't given once. It's practiced like breathing. Every inhale mercy, every exhale truth. And some days, the air feels thin." I closed the diary, drew the curtains, and stood by the window. Across the garden, the elm tree swayed gently, its leaves whispering against one another like pages turning. The book remained on the table behind me, closed now, silent. But its silence felt different, not deceitful anymore, just waiting. I knew what it wanted. It wanted to go back where it belonged, to the shelf beside the photograph, to its rightful place in the story, no longer a wound, but a scar that had learned its meaning. Tomorrow I would meet Clara again, not to accuse, not to punish, but to draw the boundary the Reverend had named. That night, I dreamt of gates, hundreds of them, stretching into the distance. Some were open, some closed. At the end of the path, one gate stood slightly ajar, and behind it, light spilled through. When I reached it, I saw that it wasn't heaven waiting, but peace. Ordinary, human, possible. I woke with tears on my cheeks and a kind of strength I hadn't known I still possessed, because now I understood what forgiveness truly was. Not a bridge to someone else, but a doorway back to myself. Morning came quietly. No wind, no birdsong. Just the steady hum of stillness that often follows a storm. The kind of quiet that feels borrowed, like the world is holding its breath. I woke before dawn, unable to shake the dream of gates. My hands reached instinctively for the condolence book. It waited on the nightstand, patient, unchanged, yet somehow different. Not heavier, not lighter, just ready. When I opened it, a faint smell of lavender escaped, Clara's scent threaded through every memory. For a moment I almost closed it again, afraid of what I'd find if I kept reading. But fear had already cost me enough years of truth. So I turned the pages, one by one, until I reached the space where that missing page should have been. The tear in the spine was jagged, raw, as if someone had tried to remove a vein from a living thing. The Reverend's words echoed softly. A wound must close so it stops bleeding. Maybe this was where mine had started to bleed. The edge of the torn binding had loosened since I'd last touched it. When I lifted the book slightly, a thin scrap of paper slipped from between the cover and the backboard, small, creased, yellowed with time. My heart stumbled. I held it up to the light. The handwriting was Robert's, no mistake. The curves of his letters were a map my eyes had traveled for half my life. It was short, uneven, as though written in haste or shame. Clara, if she ever reads this, tell her the truth was never meant to save me. Only her. The paper trembled between my fingers. The ink had faded, but the meaning hadn't. He hadn't written this for her to keep. He had written it for me to find, one day. The book wasn't an accident. It was an inheritance of pain disguised as comfort. I felt my chest tighten. The air grew heavy, too alive. I sank into Robert's chair, the paper still in my hand. The words blurred through my tears until they almost vanished. He had asked her to lie to me. To protect me from what exactly? His betrayal? His weakness? Or from the image of him I had built and loved so fiercely I might have shattered trying to keep it whole? The morning light stretched across the floor, touching the book like truth, tracing the edge of a wound. For the first time, I understood what forgiveness might mean. Not absolution, but release from illusion. Robert had chosen Clara not for love, but for cowardice. She had been the witness he needed for the end of his life, the one who could see him frail and human, without the weight of vows or history. I had been the memory he wanted to leave unsullied. I had been preserved, not loved rightly. I whispered into the empty room. You didn't spare me, Robert. You only delayed me. The house answered with silence. Later that day, I went to the garden. The sun had risen high, but the light felt muted, filtered through clouds that looked uncertain of their purpose. The air smelled faintly of rosemary, Robert's herb. I sat on the bench beneath the elm and opened the book to the final pages. Every entry, every word written by others, seemed to rearrange itself into a pattern I could finally see. The sentences that once brought comfort now revealed their symmetry, as if Clara had guided some of them herself, editing what the mourners wrote, leaving traces of her pen across the margins. I noticed small things, extra commas, repeated words, flourishes that weren't common in this town, the meticulous touch of someone desperate to keep a narrative intact. But one message stood out, an old one, dated only 2 days before Robert's death. It was signed in an unfamiliar hand, yet the phrasing struck me. He spoke of peace and how the hardest mercy is truth left unspoken. It wasn't from any of our friends, and the phrasing, the rhythm, was his. Robert's, written through another hand, dictated maybe, or copied by someone who wanted his last words to sound noble. Someone who couldn't bear him to seem human in the end. I traced that line, my fingers trembling. Truth left unspoken. How many lives collapse under those 3 words? A sound startled me. Footsteps on gravel. I turned. Clara was standing by the gate, pale against the sunlight. She wore no coat, just a cardigan pulled too tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes looked tired, as if she hadn't slept since the day she left. "I thought you might be here," she said softly. Her voice was careful, the way people speak to wild animals or old wounds. I didn't answer. I just closed the book and rested it on my lap. She stepped closer. "I've been praying," she said. "But prayers don't work when they're half-truths." Her honesty disarmed me. It wasn't contrition that I saw in her. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes after years of carrying a lie too heavy for one's soul. "I found the missing page," I said quietly. Her breath caught. You did?" I nodded. For a moment, she looked relieved, almost grateful. Then the color drained from her face. "Then you know." "Yes," I said, "but I want to hear it from you." She sat beside me on the bench, the air between us sharp and unsteady. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The leaves whispered above, a language older than our grief. Finally, she said, "He didn't mean to hurt you. He did it anyway." She nodded. "He thought he was protecting you from the truth." "By giving it to you instead?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He was dying, Margaret. He needed someone who wasn't drowning beside him, someone who could hold his fear without turning it into despair. He didn't want you to remember him as weak. And so he gave that part of himself to you." She nodded again, slowly. "He loved you too much to let you see him break." I laughed then, quietly, bitterly. "And he trusted you enough to let you watch." Her tears fell. "It wasn't love between us, not the kind that steals or takes. It was duty, maybe, a devotion neither of us could explain. He wanted to leave you with light, and Her voice broke. "I wanted to believe that kindness could hide the wrong kind of love." We sat in silence for a while. The wind carried the faint scent of the lavender she used to wear. The same scent still clung to the book's pages. "I read his last note," I said. "He wrote that the truth wasn't meant to save him, only me." Her eyes widened. "You weren't supposed to find that." "I was always supposed to," I said, "just not until I was strong enough." She bowed her head, her shoulders trembling. "Then maybe now you are." For the first time, I looked at her not as the betrayer, but as the keeper of a terrible mercy. A woman who had carried the ugliness of my marriage so I could keep believing it was beautiful. How could I hate her for that? She reached out, her hand hovering over mine. "Do you hate me?" I shook my head. "No, but I can't love you the way I used to." Her hand withdrew, trembling. "I wouldn't expect you to." We sat like that for a long while, 2 women caught between what was right and what was real. Then I opened the book, turned to the space where the page had been, and placed the fragment, Robert's note, into her hands. "It belongs to you," I said. "You were the one who kept it hidden. You should be the one to put it to rest." She took it carefully, her fingers brushing mine. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "I've already buried what needed to die." When she left, the garden felt emptier, but lighter too. I stayed on the bench until the sun began to sink, the light turning gold against the edges of the trees. The book lay open beside me, fluttering in the evening breeze. It looked less like a wound now, more like a relic. I touched the pages one last time. They were smooth, familiar, no longer hiding anything. The margins that once whispered secrets were quiet at last. I realized then that closure isn't something you find. It's something you stop running from. That night, I returned the book to its shelf. The candlelight flickered against the wall, the same golden hue that had once danced over Robert's hands when he wrote letters at this desk. I traced the spine, whispering, "Forgiveness is not yours, Robert. It's mine." And as I spoke, the house seemed to exhale, not in sorrow, but in peace. Later, in my diary, I wrote, "Tonight I learned that truth, even when late, still arrives on time. That love built on half-light cannot stand, and mercy that hides the wound only deepens it. I will keep no more secrets on his behalf, nor hers, nor mine. Tomorrow, I'll write my own message in that book, not to the dead, but to the living." I closed the diary and let the night fold around me. Outside, the wind moved through the elm, scattering a few leaves onto the windowsill. They landed gently, like soft applause from the earth itself. I had avoided that door for almost a year. Robert's study remained exactly as he left it, the room where air felt heavy with unfinished thoughts. Whenever I passed it in the hallway, I imagined him sitting behind the desk, pen in hand, turning phrases into prayers and silence into meaning. Even after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to touch the doorknob. But the day Clara left with his last note, I knew it was time. Not to grieve him again, but to meet what remained. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Paper and cedar, faint traces of tobacco from the pipe he used to keep near the window. The scent of a man who believed that wisdom could hide in solitude. Dust floated in the sunlight, drifting like small souls unsure of where to land. The curtains were half drawn, the light golden and gentle, merciful light, not interrogating anymore. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the air remember me. The room was small, filled with the quiet of someone who left mid-thought. His desk was still covered in notebooks, some open, some sealed with ribbon. The fountain pen lay diagonally across a stack of paper, its ink long dried, but its posture patient, as if waiting for a final sentence. I walked slowly, fingers grazing the spines of his books, philosophy, sermons, poetry. Margins filled with his tiny notes, those half-legible reflections he never shared. There was comfort in the order of his chaos, letters arranged by year, papers stacked by relevance, even his glasses folded neatly atop a dictionary. But beneath the calm lay something else. That lingering tension, the one that had lived between us long before death drew its curtain. I sat at his chair. The wood creaked faintly, the sound startlingly intimate. I placed my hands where his had rested thousands of mornings. The surface of the desk bore faint impressions, circular rings from cups, scratches from years of thoughts pressed too hard onto paper. I wondered how many of those marks were made on nights he wrote to Clara instead of me. That thought didn't hurt as much as I expected. It only saddened me in a quieter way, the way realization does when anger has burned itself out. The top drawer opened easily. Inside were envelopes tied with twine, some addressed, some not. Most in his handwriting, one in mine. A letter I had written years ago but never sent, still folded neatly with its words unsaid. I untied the twine. Among the letters was a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked at the edges, its pages yellowed. Inside, his handwriting sprawled freely, raw, unedited, unguarded. I began to read. Grief is a slow teacher. I am learning her language in advance. That first line froze me. He had written it months before his diagnosis. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, "I fear leaving Margaret with more silence than love." Page after page revealed pieces of him I'd never met. The Robert who questioned his faith, who feared his kindness might not be enough, who longed for a way to tell the truth without breaking what he built. One entry stopped me cold. Clara listens without judgment. She reminds me of Margaret before the world became heavy. I write because she listens, not because I've forgotten whom I love. It was neither confession nor excuse, just the complicated honesty of a man who couldn't bear to be perfect anymore. Tears came, slow but certain. I let them. They felt different now, not sharp, but cleansing. Each tear carried both his failure and my understanding, dissolving the border between guilt and grace. I whispered to the empty room, "You should have trusted me to love you in your weakness." The house seemed to exhale again, wood settling, dust stirring. I read further. "If I die before her, let the truth reach her as gently as sunlight on tired hands. She deserves that much." There it was again, gently. The word that had haunted every message he left behind. It wasn't a plea for concealment, it was an instruction for tenderness. He hadn't wanted her to lie. He had wanted me to discover him slowly, in my own time, without cruelty. But Clara had mistaken gentleness for secrecy, mercy for silence, and in that misunderstanding, we had both been broken. I closed the journal and looked around the room. Every object seemed to echo some unfinished part of our story. The chair near the window where he'd sit, reading at dusk. The half-filled decanter he never touched after his diagnosis. The clock that had stopped the morning he died, frozen at 7:46. It struck me then how everything we leave behind becomes a monument to what we couldn't finish. As the light dimmed, I stood and opened the window. Cool air entered, stirring the curtains like breath returning to a body. From outside, the elm rustled softly, the same tree under which I had faced Clara the day before. The breeze scattered a few papers across the floor, pages from his journal, a few loose notes, one envelope without a name. I bent down to pick it up. Inside was a single sheet, blank except for one line. "If love survives truth, it becomes faith." I held the paper to my chest, feeling the truth of it. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about how love evolves once illusion dies, what remains when the light has burned through everything false. I gathered the papers carefully and placed them back into the drawer. Before closing it, I hesitated. Then, on impulse, I took the condolence book from my bag and set it inside the drawer, next to the journal. "Rest here," I whispered, "with the man who made you both wound and cure." It felt right, to place the lies beside the truth, the comfort beside the confession. I closed the drawer slowly. The click echoed softly, like the sound of a door closing behind a soul finally at peace. Before leaving, I took one last look around the study. It was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary reclaimed. The walls no longer whispered loss. They hummed with something quieter. Acceptance, maybe even gratitude. I turned off the lamp and paused at the doorway. The last light of day fell across the desk, illuminating the empty chair. It no longer frightened me, because I finally understood that absence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's space, the space truth needs to grow. That evening, as dusk folded the sky, I wrote in my diary, "Today I walked into the room I feared most and left it unafraid. I have stopped asking why he lied and started asking how I will live now that I know. Maybe love is not the promise we make to another person, but the vow we keep to ourselves when truth demands it. Tomorrow, I will light a candle by the elm and write one last message in the condolence book. Not for him, not for Clara, for me." That night, I didn't dream of gates or ghosts. I dreamed of a door, wide open, sunlight spilling through it. And on the threshold stood no one else but myself, waiting, calm, unafraid. I carried the letters to the hearth the way one carries a sleeping child, careful, reverent, already grieving what comes after the lullaby. The evening had settled into that thin hour when the house goes quiet before the first lamps are lit. Outside, the elm rustled like a choir whispering its amen. Inside, I laid Robert's journal, the loose notes, and the copied messages on the iron grate. All that was left of a marriage and its shadows, stacked like winter wood. The matchbox felt heavier than it should. My hands knew where to find it without looking. I had stood in this very place the week after the funeral, ready to set fire to the last of his medical papers. Then, too, I'd told myself that flames were a kind of mercy. Fire doesn't argue. Fire does not prolong. It makes quick decisions and asks you to call that justice. I struck a match. Sulfur bloomed, sharp, clean, impatient. The flame lifted and leaned, as if hungry. I lowered it toward the edge of a letter that began with his careful hand, "My dear," and stopped at the comma. A pause long enough to hold a life. Heat licked my skin. The paper curled, thirsty for ruin. My breath caught, and in that thin space between yes and no, I remembered something small, Clara's voice the day she brought lemons, wavering as she said, "Sometimes the good we do hurts someone else." She had meant it as apology. I heard it now as a warning. What if destruction pretended to be mercy the way secrecy once did? I blew the match out. Smoke spiraled up like a question with no word to sit on. I lit another. The second flame trembled differently. Not eager, watchful. I held it over the pages without touching them, letting the light spill across Robert's words. A few ash flecks lifted from the grate and drifted toward me, soft as confetti at a widower's parade. If I burned these, I thought, the story would stop moving. The river would freeze mid-current and I could walk away from it, dry-shoed, unstained. But a frozen river is not a healed one. It only waits for warmer weather to break your footing. The match burned down to my fingers. I let it go. It fell into the grate and died with a hiss that sounded almost relieved. I gathered the pages back into my hands and pressed them to my chest. My heart beat through them as if trying to print itself on the paper. The room darkened by a shade. Dusk reached across the floorboards like a tide. I heard the Reverend in my ear, "Forgiveness is a gate." And another voice, older and closer, mine. "Do not confuse silence with peace." I tucked the papers under my arm and carried them to the dining table, where sunlight had always been most honest in this house. I spread them out, as one might lay out a map, before deciding which road is true and which road merely looks like escape. A moth thudded against the window pane, twice, 3 times. Too stubborn to understand that light behind glass won't feed it. I watched the small body fall onto the sill and turn still. I whispered, "I know," to the tiny silence it left. Then I began to sort, his words in one column, hers in another, mine in a third. Truth looks different depending on whose hand carried the ink. Robert was all chiaroscuro, confession that flinched every time it neared the light. Clara's lines were tidy, disciplined. Even her remorse chose its adjectives carefully, as if hoping grammar might absolve what grace had not yet touched. And mine, my words, were steady now. No ornaments, no excuses. Sorrow without syrup. Halfway through, I found a page I'd missed, thin, nearly transparent, the kind of paper you use when you mean to hide something important in plain sight. It was dated a month before he died. If love is a roof, then truth is the beam. I tried to leave her the shelter without the weight. But shelter without structure is just a soft collapse. I closed my eyes and let that line enter the room like a person. When I looked again, the letters seemed brighter than the page could hold. I remembered how Robert sometimes traced the chip on his cup with his thumb, as if memorizing flaw could make it safer to hold. He had tried to do that with me, with us, and found a stranger's shoulder easier to lean on. It was not noble, it was simply human. And in the end, Being human is what kills us and saves us both. I stacked the pages gently. The urge to ignite had not vanished. It had changed shape. What I wanted to burn was not paper, but permission, the old reflex that told me destruction equals control. I wanted to set fire to a habit, not a history. The clock in the hall clicked past the half hour. The light in the kitchen turned silver. I made tea because hands need tasks when hearts are occupied. The kettle sang its small, wet hymn, and I poured the water over a bag of chamomile. The steam drifted up and reminded me of those mornings we did not speak and called it comfort. Before the tea cooled, I carried the letters back to the study and set them beside the journal in the drawer. When I slid it closed this time, there was no echo, just wood meeting wood, a quiet agreement between past and present. I returned to the hearth because endings should be told to the place that expected them. I knelt, lit one final match, and let it burn in the empty grate. Not to consume anything, only to witness that I had chosen not to. The small flame flickered like a pulse and then bowed itself to smoke. "You don't get to decide for me anymore," I said into the dark iron, not sure if I spoke to the fire, to Robert, or to the part of me that had mistaken ash for absolution. The house exhaled. The elm answered with a hush. I slept that night without dreams. Morning came clean. The air smelled of rain that had not yet begun, but promised it would. I rose with the same certainty and opened the window. The sky wore a pale face, the kind of day that asks for truth and expects to be obeyed. I pulled the condolence book from the shelf and, with a pen steadier than I'd ever known, wrote on the first blank page near the back. I loved a man who was brave in public and frightened in private. I was his roof. I will be my own beam. Forgiveness is not return. It is the border where love keeps its dignity. Ink shines a certain way when it is the first honest thing of the day. I watched it settle into the paper like good rain into dry earth. Then I lifted the book and felt how its weight had shifted, the way a body does when it finally decides to breathe without counting. A knock at the door. Knuckles, polite but urgent. I closed the book and went to answer. Clara stood there, raincoat unbuttoned, hair damp with the morning's promise. She held a small envelope in her left hand and nothing in her right. Empty. A detail that mattered. "I didn't know if I should come," she said. "You did," I answered, and stepped aside. In the kitchen, she wouldn't sit until I did. Old habits, deference performing its faithful dance. She placed the envelope on the table and nudged it toward me. "It's what was left of the page," she said, eyes lowered. "I kept a piece because I wanted to keep one part of him that was only mine." She swallowed. It made me smaller. I slid the envelope closer, but didn't open it. Instead, I watched her hands, still, for once, not twisting a ring, not reaching for a cup or a rag or a lie. Her hands released from doing. "I didn't burn anything," I said. A soft sound escaped her, a relief she hadn't asked for. "I thought fire would finish it," I continued. "But finishing is not the same as healing. He wrote that truth was meant to save me, not him. I think I finally understand." She lifted her gaze. There was an absence in her eyes where some vanity used to live. Emptiness is not always lack. Sometimes it is room. "I don't ask you to understand me," she said. "Only to know that I thought I was keeping you from drowning." "You held me above water," I said, "just long enough to keep me from learning to swim. I will not resent you for saving my breath, but I cannot thank you for stealing my lesson." She nodded once, receiving the sentence like a sacrament that stung and sanctified at once. "May I put it back?" she asked, touching the envelope. "No," I said gently. "I will. And then the book will return to the shelf where it belongs, not as an altar, as a record." We stood. The ritual chose itself. I opened the envelope and found a torn strip, Robert's flourish at the end of his name, the echo of a signature that had also been a farewell. I placed it between the final pages, closed the book, and pressed the cover as if I were sealing a letter to an address that no longer existed. Clara reached for her coat. Something in her posture steadied. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but not here at the table, not in the kitchen where kindness learned to lie. If we meet, it will be at the door, on the step, beneath the sky. Distance that is not punishment, only truth measured in feet." Tears rose and did not fall. She nodded. "I will stand on the step." After she left, I stayed a while, listening for nothing. Silence filled with courage smells different, cleaner, almost sweet. I carried the book to the study and set it back in the drawer beside the journal. Not hidden, housed. Then I returned to the kitchen and opened the window wide. Wind pushed through the house, gathering corners, lifting the curtain's hem, finding the hall, making a small ceremony of moving on. On the table, the matchbox remained. I took one match and broke it in half. Not an oath, just a reminder. By afternoon, rain finally came. Not harsh, not dramatic, persistent. The kind of rain that does not announce itself as cleansing, yet nothing is dusty afterward. I brewed tea and sat by the window with my palms around the cup, not for warmth, but for the simple proof that I could hold something without breaking it. As the garden blurred behind its veil, I thought about the last time I had asked God for anything specific. It had been the day Robert died. I'd asked for a sign that love would not become a ghost that moved the furniture of my heart without asking. The sign hadn't come. Instead, there was a book, a friend, a secret, and a study that smelled of cedar and human failure. Perhaps that was the sign. Life arriving as it is, asking me to become the kind of woman who does not need her miracles tidy. I whispered into the rain, "I forgive you," and let the sentence carry a plural. Not names, just direction. Night pressed its forehead to the windows. I lit one candle and turned the book so its spine faced the room, not the wall. The flame wavered, then held. In its light, I saw the kitchen as a stage that would no longer host the old play. The props remained, the kettle, the cups, the salt, but the script had changed. I would learn my new lines in silence. Before bed, I walked to the shelf where the condolence book had lived since the funeral and left a small space vacant beside the spot where it would return tomorrow. An absence prepared for presence is a different kind of peace. The house noticed and approved. I slept early and woke once, just after midnight, to the sound of water easing from the gutters. I lay there without fear, not empty, not full, proportioned. The way a heart feels after it has chosen the border and knows it will keep it, even if no one claps. Toward morning, I dreamed that the hearth bloomed with a cool fire, blue, quiet, unhungry. In the dream, it warmed the room without taking anything. When I put my hand into it, it did not burn. I woke smiling at an impossible mercy and said aloud into the pale light, "Not everything that shines asks for sacrifice." The day that followed would take me to the shelf and to the door and back again. There would be a meeting in the room with the elm just beyond the glass. There would be a page read for the last time and not returned, and an answer I had been circling would finally stand up and speak in a voice that sounded like my own. But I'm ahead of myself. For now, the matches sleep, the drawer holds, the rain keeps its patient sermon on the roof. And somewhere beneath the sound of it, I hear what I could not hear before, the house breathing with me, unafraid of what I will keep and what I will let go. The rain had the discipline of a metronome. It marked the hours without asking me to count them, and yet I counted anyway. 72. That was how long until the day the calendar had turned into an altar, Robert's death anniversary. A year isn't long enough to forget a voice. It is just long enough to learn what silence sounds like when it stops pretending to be peace. I woke before the first bus hissed along the main road. The house listened with me. A chair remembered the shape of someone who no longer sat. The hallway, the smell of cedar, the steady clock, each kept time in a different language, and I was fluent in all of them now. I put water on to boil and opened the window an inch. The air was cool and smelling faintly of iron, as if the sky had been sharpening itself for hours. On the table, the condolence book waited. Not a wound anymore. Not a weapon. A record. And records require a closing entry. I didn't touch it yet. I let the kettle mutter its small comfort and thought of Gates. The Reverend had given me a definition that would not stop echoing. Forgiveness as a border. It sounded practical in his mouth. It felt holy in mine. I reached for a pen and the small stack of stationery I kept by the bread box. The paper had blue lines so faint you had to choose to notice them. That choice mattered. I wrote one sentence. Thursday, just before dusk. Come to the house. We'll return what belongs to the shelf. No more details than that. Not a trap. A meeting. I folded the page, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote her name in the middle. Clara. No miss, no misses. Just the person I would not invite past the threshold again, and, for now, still needed to see. As I sealed it, the kettle reached its one high note and fell quiet. The envelope sat beneath my palm like a small, beating creature. I lifted it, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked out into a morning the color of watered milk. At the post box, I paused. It is a small thing to open a door, drop a letter, and hear it land. The world doesn't change sound when you do. But something in me steadied as the envelope slid away. The metal mouth closed, the hinge sighed. I knew she would come. People who have carried a secret long enough are drawn to endings the way tired birds find the low branch. On my way home, I stopped at the market and bought pears. Robert loved pears when they were almost too ripe, soft, fragrant, collapsing into sweetness without warning. I held one up to my face in the middle of the aisle and breathed in sugar and earth. The grocer didn't speak. He knew grief when it shopped and chose not to haggle with it. Back home, I set the pears in a white bowl and took one to the sink. The peel came away in a smooth spiral, one unbroken ribbon. I placed the coil on the counter like a small green river and ate the pear over the sink, because some sweetness is best taken without ceremony. Juice ran down my wrist. For a moment, I felt like an animal that didn't have to think. It was a relief. 70 hours now. I wiped my hands, rinsed the knife, folded a clean towel over the edge of the sink, and went to the study. The door did not resist me anymore. In the old room's soft light, I took out Robert's journal and read the last entry again. If love survives truth, it becomes faith. The words were no longer a riddle, they were a road. I traced them with my fingertip. When I closed the cover, I knew which room love would live in from now on. The one with windows. The one where air moved. On my way back down the hall, I stopped at the linen closet. On the top shelf sat a small glass bottle of lavender oil. I had put it there months ago when the scent became too woven into my days to remain a comfort. I held it to the light and saw tiny flecks suspended inside, like the idea of a field. I opened it and let one drop fall onto a cloth. A clean, unhidden version of the smell passed across my face and didn't hurt. Some things only wound when we forced them to hide. 68 hours. People think grief makes you fragile. It doesn't. It makes you exact. By afternoon, I had copied the dates from the book onto a single page. Funeral, letters, hospital, the day Clara first signed with an initial instead of a name. The timeline looked like a staircase built with some steps missing. I could see where the fall happened and where I'd mistaken it for flight. I made tea and sat by the window. The elm had been a witness to more of this story than any human I knew. It held rain like a patience I envied. When wind moved through it, the branches answered in a language wiser than any counsel. They bowed and did not break. I thought of the children then. Daniel, Claire, Emma, names braided with my own in so many rooms. Each had called me more often those first months than I called them. Love can be clumsy when it wants to be helpful. I had let them play at competence because it gave them dignity. They had let me pretend not to need them because it gave me room. We had built an honest house out of bad timing and good intentions. I would tell them one by one after Thursday, not from injury, from completion. The phone rang. Emma. Mom? Her voice always arrived like a hand outstretched, palm up. Are you all right? I am, I said. And I will be. That sounds like you, she said, relief a soft rustle through the line. We spoke of small things, her neighbor's new baby, a book she knew I'd like, and we did not touch the obvious. When we hung up, I felt steadier than before. Children teach you how to stop explaining the unexplainable. 65 hours. Evening drew its veil and the house changed color. I lit one candle and watched the flame steadiness decide mine. Then I opened the condolence book to the back, where clean pages waited. I didn't write my final entry yet. It is important to know the difference between readiness and ripeness. The doorbell rang. On the step stood a young man who had played the organ at Robert's service. He held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. From the Reverend, he said. He said you might need it now. Inside was a thin book of psalms, well thumbed, margins crowded with pencil notes that didn't belong to Whitmore's hand. A woman's writing, round and swift. His late wife then, her voice a soft crowd around the old songs. On the title page, to any heart carrying more than one truth at a time. I smiled into the kindness of being seen by the past. After he left, I opened to a page marked with a ribbon. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. I slid the ribbon higher and let the line sit in the room until the room felt equal to it. 62 hours. Sleep came like a stranger who knows the house by instinct. I woke twice, once to rain easing, once to it returning. At dawn, the light had the clarity of cold water. I put on Robert's old sweater, the one I had washed too many times to carry his smell anymore, and walked the garden. Wet soil remembered every step I'd taken this year. The elm dripped gently, as if giving the ground back what it borrowed from the sky. At the base of the bench, a small blue thing brightened the mulch. A cornflower, pressed once and now somehow free, must have slipped from the book days ago and found the earth. The color looked impossible against the brown. I crouched, touched the petal. It didn't crumble. Some things return to form when we stop pinning them down. 58 hours. I went inside and baked a loaf of bread. My hands wanted to knead, to fold, to shape something that would feed me without speaking. Flour fell like a gentle weather over the counter. The dough rose under a towel as if obeying a quiet law. When the crust browned, it filled the kitchen with a warmth that did not owe itself to memory. I sliced the first heel while steam still made its case and ate it with butter, standing alone in a simple happiness that refused to apologize. 54. By afternoon, an invitation sat on the table like a promise. Dusk, Thursday. I pictured Clara receiving it. Would she show it to anyone? Hide it beneath a stack of folded towels? Read it at the sink and dry her hands too carefully? At some point, pity tries to recruit you. I let it pass without signing its sheet. The door knocked again, softer than last time. The Reverend, alone, hat in his hands. I didn't want to disturb you, he said. I also didn't want to leave this to the post. He held out a small, flat box. Inside lay a fountain pen, well cared for, inked and ready. A proper tool for a final line, he said. May your hand be kinder than your pain. We sat in the kitchen without speaking for a while, two people trained by a long world to keep words from trampling holy ground. When he rose, he touched the back of the chair that had been Robert's place at supper, a blessing disguised as a habit. At the door, he said only, "When you return the book to its place, Look to the left. Then he left me to the puzzle. 50 hours. The house decided to be still for the rest of the day. No callers, no phone. I sorted the laundry with unusual care, pressed 2 skirts that did not need pressing, polished a spoon until my face bent faithfully in its bowl. When grief no longer needs a performance, the smallest chore becomes a kind of prayer. I took the pen from its box and sat at the table. The book lay open to the last blank page where my hand would speak. Still, I waited. Ripeness, not readiness. I turned the pen between my fingers and watched light crawl along the barrel. The nib looked like a small ship ready for a voyage that would not fear shallow waters. 46 hours. I slept and woke to a sky learning blue again. Seagulls from the river cut across the morning like punctuation. I ironed the dress I would wear, dark, simple, the one with a small repair at the waist only I knew. I set aside a cardigan and the pearl earrings Emma insisted I keep. Armor can be gentle if it is honest about what it protects. 40 hours. I walked to the chapel. It was empty, as if it had been waiting for my shoes. I sat in the 4th pew from the front and read the psalm again. Mercy and truth meeting, righteousness and peace exchanging a quiet kiss. For a moment, I believed that sentence might be the map for every broken house. When I left, I touched the doorframe and thanked it for keeping my seat without asking a rent. 37. The letter carrier waved as he passed my gate. His bag looked lighter. The world had chosen fewer words today. I took that as a kind omen. Back inside, I dusted the shelf where the book would return. On the left, just as the Reverend had said, sat a narrow space between volumes. I pulled the thinner book forward. It was one of Robert's, sermons on love and duty he never published. A page had been marked by a dried sprig, rosemary, brittle, and gray-green. I opened to it. An underlined paragraph. To tell the truth without charity is to love one's own accuracy more than another's soul. To hide the truth in the name of charity is to love one's own comfort more than another's freedom. The cross between them is our work. I sat down and let the sentence braid itself into everything I had learned this week. He had not always lived his own counsel. Few of us do. But I could live mine. I returned the book to the shelf and cleared the space beside it, a place prepared. 32 hours. 2. I wrote letters to the children, not explanations, accounts. The difference is the distance between pleading and witness. I told Daniel that the house would not be rearranged. Order is not mercy if it asks memory to move. I told Claire that her peacekeeping had the nobility of those who run toward fires with blankets instead of water. I told Emma that tenderness is a force, not a concession, and that I had learned to use mine like a tool, not a leash. I sealed each envelope. My hand did not shake. I stacked them beside the pears. They looked right together. Letters and fruit, something to read, something to eat. 28 hours. Night came with a clean edge. I bathed, I braided my hair, I slept. When I woke, the day had the softness of linen first lifted from a drawer. Thursday. I made the bed with care and opened the windows in every room. Air took the house by the hand and walked it into morning. I brewed coffee instead of tea. Robert always said coffee was for decisions. I poured it into a cup that wasn't his and drank it black. By noon, the sky had chosen a steady light. I set the table as if for an ordinary supper, a cloth, 2 plates I would not use, a bowl of pears in the center. The book lay closed at my place, the pen set across it like a quiet promise. On the shelf, the gap waited, a small mouth ready to receive. 3 hours. I went to the mirror and watched my own face until it stopped being a stranger's. I put on the dress and the cardigan and the pearls. I looked like myself, not a memory. That was the point. 2. I stood by the window and listened to the elm breathe. The street exhaled its traffic, then settled into that slow hour when light decides where it wants to fall. A car door closed somewhere. Footsteps, the gate, one, The bell. I opened the door. Clara stood with empty hands. No flowers, no basket, no scarf to twist. I stepped aside. She did not cross the threshold. Good, she understood. "We'll talk here," I said, and pointed to the spot just inside the entry where the shelf could see us. She nodded. Her eyes took in the room the way a traveler takes in a station, looking for signs, accepting that trains leave when they must. I led her to the shelf and stood with my back to the window so that light could decide whose face it needed to read. "The book goes back tonight," I said, with one last line. Asked? She nodded again. "Yours." "Mine," I said. "Not his, not yours, mine." I opened it and turned to the final page. The pen waited where I'd left it. I didn't hesitate now. The sentence had lime and salt to it, clean, unmistakable. "I release you both to the truth. I keep myself for the same." I let the ink settle, closed the cover, and felt the weight change. I slid the book into its place. The spine's leather met its neighbors with a soft, satisfied sound. On the left, the rosemary-marked sermon leaned as if relieved to share the load. On the right, an old family photo album stood like a benign bystander who had finally heard the ending. I turned. Clara's face had softened into something I had not seen there since before the hospital days, unarmed. "Thank you," she said, though I had not offered a gift she could own. "What happens now?" "We meet like this," I said, motioning to the threshold. "When needed. We do not sit, we do not share rooms, we do not carry each other's secrets. If we speak of him, we do it as two witnesses, not as conspirators. If we speak of me, it will be on my terms." She breathed in, a small hitch at the top of it, and nodded. A boundary spoken becomes a wall only to those who plan to climb it. She took a step back toward the door. "Will you be all right on the day?" she asked. And by the day we both meant tomorrow, the anniversary, the circle closing where it began. "I will be more than all right," I said. "I will be exact." She smiled, an honest, weary curve, and left. The bell did not ring on her way out. Some exits learn their manners. I stood very still in the entryway. The house felt level, as if a carpenter had come while we spoke and righted the frames. The pear bowl shone gently on the table. The shelf breathed with me. I went to the window and watched dusk gather itself, not in a hurry, not reluctant. Tomorrow would have its own work. Candles, a quiet bench under the elm, perhaps the psalm with the kiss in it, perhaps a line in my diary that needed no audience. And something else I could not yet name, but it was already moving toward me, steady as weather. For now the book was home. The pen lay quiet. The gate stood where I'd built it, and the path on my side was clear. I closed the window and let the evening take its gentle seat in the room, knowing it would rise early to open the door to the day that waited, patient, just beyond. The day began as it had a year ago, gray at first, then slowly washed in the pale gold of reluctant sunlight. But everything else was different. The air didn't cling to my skin the way grief used to. The house didn't echo. Even silence had softened its edges. For the first time in 12 months, I didn't wake to the sound of loss. I woke to the sound of life continuing. A distant bird, the creak of the elm's old branch, the murmur of the kettle deciding to boil. Ordinary sounds. The kind that once went unnoticed when sorrow took all the space. Today was the anniversary. A year since Robert's heart had failed, since Clara's secret began, since I buried the man and the illusion that came with him. I made the bed slowly, smoothing every fold as if calming a restless child. Each movement was deliberate, a ritual, not a routine. I dressed in light gray, neither mourning nor celebration. On the bedside table, the psalm book lay open to the same verse the Reverend had marked. "Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other." I read it aloud this time. The words didn't tremble in my mouth. They rested there, balanced, like something earned. Downstairs, the light through the kitchen window looked alive. Not harsh, not dramatic, but steady. I poured coffee, not tea. The steam rose like the memory of something I used to fear, but no longer did. The shelf stood to my left, patient and complete. The condolence book, the rosemary-marked sermon, the family album, aligned, breathing quietly. They were no longer reminders of loss. They were coordinates of a map I'd learned to read. I lit one candle on the table, not for Robert, but for truth. It flickered once, twice, then held steady, like a pulse rediscovered. On a small plate beside it, I placed one of the pears from the bowl. Ripe, perfect. The scent filled the room, sweet, almost defiant. When I stepped outside, the air carried the soft scent of soil and rain. The garden shimmered with dew. Each blade of grass held its own small universe of light. The elm stood tall, its trunk dark and glistening from last night's rain. This was the bench where I'd first confronted Clara, where truth had walked in barefoot and stayed. I sat. The wood was cool beneath my palms. The wind brushed through the branches above, scattering a few leaves onto my lap. I didn't brush them away. From my pocket, I took Robert's journal, the one I'd read in his study. I had brought it here to finish the circle. The pages still carried his faint scent, ink and cedar and time. I turned to the last page he had written. It ended mid-sentence. If she ever finds her way through the dark, let her know I never meant... It stopped there. No ending. No period. Perhaps he had been interrupted by pain, or perhaps by fear. For a long time, I stared at the half-finished line. Then I took the fountain pen the Reverend had given me, uncapped it, and completed the sentence myself. To make her smaller than the love we shared. The ink bled into the old paper, merging with his words as if they had waited for mine all along. I closed the journal gently and whispered, "We finish each other differently now." The morning passed in stillness. I stayed on that bench for hours, not thinking, not remembering, just existing. Every few minutes, a bird landed on the lowest branch, pecked at something invisible, then flew away. I envied their unburdened purpose. I thought of the Reverend's phrase, "Truth must be disturbed before it can heal." This was what healing looked like. No fireworks, no final revelations, just the quiet ability to sit beside what once burned and not flinch. I placed the journal on the bench beside me. The pages fluttered in the breeze one last time before settling. I took the psalm book from my bag and read a passage aloud, my voice steady against the wind. He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds. The sound didn't echo. It simply joined the air, part of the world again, not the world's plea. When I went back inside, the light in the house had changed. It wasn't bright, it was present. Presence has a way of remaking old spaces. The study smelled faintly of paper and lavender oil. I opened the drawer and touched the journal one last time before setting it atop the shelf. Next to it, I placed the psalm book, Whitmore's wife's copy, its edges worn, its ribbon marking the verse that had guided me home. Then I did something I hadn't done since before Robert's illness. I opened every curtain. Light rushed in like forgiveness that had been waiting at the door all along. It filled corners that had forgotten their shapes. It rested on photographs, on the table, on the empty chair. It even touched the old clock that had stopped at 7:46. The hand didn't move, but it no longer looked dead. It looked dignified, like time choosing rest. At noon, Claire called. "Mom," she said softly. "We were wondering if you'd like company today." "I have company," I said. "The house is keeping me good company." She hesitated, then smiled through the line. I could hear it. "You sound like yourself again." "I am," I said. Finally. After we hung up, I realized how light my chest felt. Grief had stopped being an anchor. It had become a compass. That evening, I prepared supper: bread, pears, and a small bowl of lentil stew. The same meal Clara had made for me after the funeral. I wanted to reclaim it, to remind the body that memory can be rewritten in taste. As the pot simmered, I watched the candle burn lower. The wax had formed a small ring of gold around the base, like time folding kindly. I thought of Clara, somewhere in her house, perhaps sitting by her own window, perhaps reading the same verse I had. I wished her peace, not reconciliation. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to remain as reminders of where truth finally found air. After dinner, I returned to the garden. Dusk had painted the sky in the same violet hue as the cornflower that had fallen into the soil. The air was cool, but not unfriendly. I brought with me one of Robert's envelopes, blank, old, never used. On it, I wrote only 4 words. The light stayed. Thank you. No name, no signature. I placed it under the elm's roots, where the first flower had bloomed again, and pressed the soil gently over it. It wasn't an offering. It was acknowledgement, the simple act of leaving behind what no longer needs carrying. When I came back inside, the candle had burned out, leaving a thin trail of smoke curling upward like the spirit of a thought finally released. I didn't relight it. Darkness, too, deserved its share of the room. I sat by the window with my cup of coffee gone cold and listened to the night. The rain had stopped. The wind was asleep. The house felt balanced, every object right where it belonged. I opened my diary and wrote the last line of the day. I thought this journey would end in forgiveness. It didn't. It ended in freedom. They are not the same, but one is born from the other, like morning from twilight. Midnight came quietly, and with it, the exact hour of his passing. I stood by the window and looked out at the elm, its silhouette calm against the pale sky. The candle's smoke had vanished. The air smelled of rain and earth and peace. I whispered his name once, not in longing, not in pain, but as one speaks of an old friend who taught a necessary lesson. Then softly, to the silence that had once terrified me, I am not what was left behind. I am what remains. The clock on the wall ticked once, just once, then rested again. It was enough. In the morning, I would wake, make tea, and continue. Not as a widow, not as a survivor, but as a woman whose story had finally learned its own rhythm. Sorrow folded into strength. Love rewritten as clarity. The light through the window would touch the shelf where the book rested, and everything, even the silence, would glow with the gentle certainty of mercy meeting truth. Because some journeys don't end in heaven. They end right where you are when you finally stop running from the light that was always yours.